Thank you. I'm going to be talking about Hayek on the assumption that people know Marx, because I didn't want to repeat Marx, and also I didn't have time to pull down quotations, but I can speak on the issues. But my principal concern is to talk about Hayek, because Hayek is very influential on the right. So the background of this is an implicit comparison between Hayek and Marx, but I'm going to focus on Hayek because he's less well known. And what I want to bring out is the parallel between his views and those of Marx in certain key visions of capitalism, and of course, the great divide between them. So let me just remind you about Hayek. As an economist, he worked on money, business cycles, and then when those two things made him, as Marx put it, decidedly non-popular, he tried to present himself as an alternative to Keynes, and he got wiped out. So he began to write on society and on socialism and the development of capitalism as a historical entity, and that's what made him famous. So his reputation as an economist was not very good, and in economics, you don't really know much about him. But in his reputation as a person who greatly valued capitalism, and his reputation was therefore greatly revived by the failure of existing socialisms. With the fall of Russia and the Soviet system, he shot up. But the other thing that greatly revived him was that he received the Swedish Central Bank Prize in Memoriam of Alfred Nobel. Now, that is a prize, is not a Nobel Prize. In fact, it was rejected by the Nobel Foundation as a prize, but then they gave ground and allowed it to be presented at the Nobel ceremonies. And that is the prize that was invented by the Swedish Central Bank in the 60s because they were so concerned about central bankers were so concerned about the leftward drift of policy and economics. And so they wanted to have a prize to support market views and what Soros calls market worship. And the prizes were all in the early 20 years, at least 30 years, were all to essentially right-wing people, with the exception of Gunnar Myrdal, because he is Swedish, and there's no way they could give the prize if they didn't give it to Gunnar Myrdal. But Gunnar Myrdal wasn't an economist; he was a sociologist. So he got the prize because he'd written about some economic things, and apparently he was very upset at that because it was shared with the very right-wing economists, and he considered rejecting it, but in the end decided to accept it. Now, the thing about the prize is that it has absolutely cemented the use of orthodox economics, which is based on certain visions of capitalism, which I'm going to come to, and made it mandatory. There's no education in economics in any graduate program anywhere in the world that is not based on the idea of rational choice, perfect knowledge, perfect individuals, optimality of the market, general equilibrium, all of the standard tropes, and these are required, and they're all done mathematically, because if you do it mathematically, it seems more imposing. Now, I was lucky I had a foundation in engineering, and I studied some physics, so this did not impress me at all, but most people are terribly impressed by the fact that you can lay all this out in mathematics. So the purpose as a prize, as I said, was to turn the economics profession to the right. But the right has two meanings here. One meaning is back to the idea of capitalism as an ideal system, at least in principle. And that is the foundation of all economics in graduate programs now. And the other, which was a sort of byproduct in the beginning, was the idea that the market actually in practice reflected this vision. And that second idea was eroded over time by the reality of capitalism. As struggles across the world erupted, as underdevelopment came, as the World Bank got embroiled in doing all these things to support markets, and then they didn't work out that way, and then ultimately crises began to undermine this. Nonetheless, if you go anywhere in the world today, almost all economists will be of this persuasion, whether they are progressive politically, like Stiglitz and Krugman, or whether they are right-wing, like many, many of the others. Lucas is an example, Robert Lucas, who believes in rational expectations. The standard models which are used by the central banks of the world are models in which there is one person, all of humanity is represented, what's called a representative agent, who has perfect knowledge of the present and the future. And that person makes choices based on the future consequences of anything. And then there's one firm that adapts itself to the wishes of this omnipotent consumer. And from this, you get the idea that everything is perfect. The one addition to the old model was the idea that when you ask, what does it mean for people to have perfect knowledge of the future? The concession is something called rational expectations, which is to say that since the future is somewhat indeterminate, you are never exactly right, but this representative agent is right up to a statistical random error. Now, it's important that the error is random, because if it's random, nobody can learn from mistakes. Therefore, the collective individual is essentially right. And so you can't talk about errors or anything of that sort. These are very fundamental propositions, and any graduate student would have to learn all of these. What's striking is that this is the models used by central bankers and most policy people across the world in order to judge how capitalism works. And by the way, there's no role in these models for the financial sector. It's quite amazing. After the 2008 crisis, the Queen reportedly asked her economists, why didn't you see it coming? And the answer was, well, we had no, in our model, there's no role for banks or credit. And when I was invited to give a lecture at the central bank of the Bank of England, I asked them, what the hell went on? They said, well, we're working on including money into the model that we use. This is really extraordinary, because if you know anything about Marx and you know anything about the classical economics tradition, money appears in the beginning, because it's so central to the vision of capitalism. All exchange is done through the mediation of money. Money allows you to break the circuit anytime you want, because if you need to hold it, as in a time of crisis, then the rest of the circuit's not completed, because what you don't spend, they don't get, and therefore they don't hire, and so on. Yet in these models, there is literally no mathematical space for money, except if things are imperfect. So money is seen as an imperfection. This notion that you begin with perfection and you move to reality as an imperfection is fundamental to orthodox economics, whether they're progressive or not. Stiglitz and Krugman say the same thing. They start from this foundation. And yet, when you ask them, why do you do that? They go, well, you just take another assumption, the foundation, which is fundamental, and you vary it a little bit, introduce imperfections, and you get some results that mimic the real, and that's it. Of course, each one of these imperfections is applied to a different set of assumptions, and so they're not coherent because there is no general theory of imperfections. They're always modifications of the underlying theory. It's what I call the Garden of Eden approach. Should you begin with the story of how perfection existed and could have existed had not the imperfect nature of humans interfered with that. And therefore the function of an enlightened organization and enlightened interest is to make imperfect humanity behave more like the perfect. In my book, I spend a lot of time discussing these foundations, but my main interest is not methodological, it's to show that you can explain how capitalism actually works. And I take that to be the central project in Marx's economics. which he spent 40 years of his life doing and then didn't finish. I think everybody knows, but just to be sure, that Marx intended to write 6 books, which were called Capital, Money, Wage Labor, the World Market, Rent. And of those books, he only began the first book. And the first book had 4 volumes in the first book, and he only wrote the first of those, and that's volume 1 of Capital. Volumes 2 and 3 were cobbled together by Engels after Marx's death by trying to paste and put together all the pieces in Marx's study and with notes that Marx meant to do, but Engels was not working with Marx. And so the effect of that was that Marx's ideas in economics became the least known of his ideas. The ones that got picked up are the ideas about the rise of capitalism, of exploitation, of alienation, his earlier writings rather than his writings on capital. And these ideas are then projected directly on the world system. One of the things that comes out of that is the idea of monopoly, having to do with large scale. But actually, the notion of monopoly is not in Marx. And I'm going to come back to this, but he argues that what he calls concentration and centralization, which is a rising of scale and reach of capital, intensifies competition. It's Hilferding and subsequently Lenin, and then Baran and Sweezy, who popularized the notion that large scale has something to do with competition, a lack of competition. And this is because in standard economics, competition is represented by a multitude of small firms. The story doesn't function unless the firms believe that they have no effect on each other. And from this comes the ideas of oligopoly and monopoly within orthodox economics. So a portion of my book is devoted to showing that the theory of competition in Marx, which I call real competition, is fundamentally different from that of orthodox economics. It's interesting that the 2 most progressive modern economists are Stiglitz and Krugman. And Stiglitz both remain tied to this framework. They've said so many times, except that Krugman most recently gave a lecture in which he repudiated everything that he believed previously. And he says, 40 years of economics has made a wrong turn. And he said, I came to believe that I was a fraud, despite the fact that I got what he calls a Swedish thingy, which is the Swedish Central Bank Prize. I can give you a link to that lecture of his, which is quite revealing. In the end, he did say that he's right on something important, of course, but he rejects the structure of orthodox economics. Am I supposed to respond to chat? No, I guess not. So let me, with this background, begin to lay out the story of Hayek's views. And I've chosen the topics I think in order of increasing concreteness, but obviously a different order could be. The Hayek on human behavior is the first thing. And it's interesting that he has a view of human behavior which might call a low opinion of most humans, of course, not entrepreneurs, as we're going to come to, considers them lazy, improvident, wasteful, compelled by circumstances, and regulation by institutions. The compulsion of circumstances and regulation by institutions is necessary in order to make them behave in certain ways that would increase their wealth, use resources economically, and adjust means to end in a rational manner. So he does not believe that human beings operate according to the kind of rationality that orthodox economics, neoclassical economics subscribes to them, but rather argues that they must be forced to do so by circumstances, which one is the discipline of the market, and the other is institutions. And he believed that his view of human nature was grounded in reality, essentially was scientific liberalism. But he also opposed the idea of the individual. For that reason, he opposed the idea of human behavior, which dominates economics, which is the idea of a rational individual making optimal choices. In fact, he rejects all of that. I'm going to come back to that, how he and von Mises were hostile to neoclassical economics, which is why Austrian economics occupies an even smaller position in modern economics than do heterodox economists, Keynes, Marxists, and so on. Parenthetically, I have traveled, because of the book, pretty much every continent and many different countries. I think now 30 countries and 60 or 70 less. And what strikes me is that every country, including China, the economics is dominated by neoclassical economics. And some people have never heard of anything else and are shocked to discover that there's any tradition beyond this one, which they hear. So let's talk about then Hayek on the rise of capitalism, because this is very important for the comparison to Marx and obviously important to an audience like this. He says civilization arose about 8,000 years ago. I guess he's talking about the agricultural revolution, and urban life only 3,000 years. And there's been a long struggle in history to have rational thought dominate over instincts and emotions. The instincts and emotions being more suited to hunter, gatherer, and tribal life. So what he calls the great society, the great civilization, arose through a slow evolution of civilization. And he goes on to say that over the course of many generations, the good natural instincts of the tribal band were gradually subdued by culturally developed rules of conduct, which no longer concerned concrete ends and concrete means of known people, but purely abstract rules of behavior having little to do with what our instincts told us to do. Now, there he's talking about the market, as he's going to make clear again and again. So in this highly developed modern social system, society is held together by exchange and depends on the effectiveness and spread of the instrumental orientation to exchange and the rules of profitability. And so he echoes there the kind of Smithian notion that once this system is established, it ensures that every man lives by exchanging or becoming a merchant, and the society grows to be what is properly a commercial society. So this is the invisible hand and Smith's original premise. And then he goes on to say, well, but this kind of social system is not natural. And therefore, you have to suppress the natural instincts of people to help each other, take care of each other, and so on. It's only by imposing a severe discipline on all human beings who must repress their instincts and preferences in the millennial spent hunting and gathering. So therefore, the great society in this vision is against nature. And he repeats that again and again, against the instincts of people, against the instincts of what society has taught us, what evolution has taught us, I presume. But the advantage of this type of new civilization is that it's made possible the support of a population far greater than any known society previously. And then the other point he makes is that no one dictated this new civilization. It arose out of social history. It was unplanned, not by design, and therefore he doesn't have any or objects to any notion of social contracts, states of nature, other device, what he calls liberalism. Civilization, he says, rose through a process of spontaneous, unplanned development, not by design. And goes to an important point. These rules of evolution have provided a set of rules and institutions whose rationale no one fully understands. And indeed, it's not necessary to understand them. Because in seeking to understand them, human beings are all ready to down submission to the impersonal forces of the market, without realizing that the only way to submit to these impersonal forces is to these impersonal and seemingly irrational forces, is to submit to an equally uncontrollable and therefore arbitrary power of other men. So better to submit to the shifting and impersonal, and sometimes, as he's going to emphasize, exceedingly cruel forces of the market, than to open up yourself to be subject to the forces of powers of other men. And that's because the power of the market, in his view, is not arbitrary. It is something that produces a general good, even though, as he points out, it may do a lot of harm to individual people. So in this view, the notion of fairness is inappropriate because it belongs to pre-modern societies. Fairness implies that there should be a connection between individual merit and effort and achievement and reward. But the market breaks that link. And this is an interesting statement from him. Some of the least deserving individuals in conventional moral criteria receive the highest rewards. And some of the most deserving receive the least. If we want the benefits of a market order in terms of liberty and prosperity, then we must have to accept outcomes of which we disapprove. Freedom means that in some measure, we entrust our fate to forces which we do not control. And that's the fundamental rationale of faith in the market. Now, it's interesting, I was going to come to it later, but let me just jump to it now because it also seems appropriate here. He says, the real dilemma in education is to teach the young, since many of them are unworthy will succeed and many more worthy will fail, that this is a good system. So you have to teach the young, even though they're worthy, that you will fail. Many of them will fail. Even though they're unworthy, some will succeed. And he argues that the trouble with the young is that they're intrinsically socialist. And you have to break that socialism, that bond to other people. Excuse me. Because that is what gives them a foundation for thinking that capitalism should be fair and should be moral. I have no idea whether they had children, but I'd be very curious to know how they turned out, whether he actually applied that. So this then moves me to the operation of capitalism, Hayek's view of the operations of capitalism. And you can see everything I'm saying here has a parallel and counterpart in Marx. Not all in one places, but you can see that in his writings, you can find these. But the sharpest contrast, however, comes in Hayek's analysis of the laws of capitalist motion, of the laws of capitalism. He believes that the factory system is a great advantage, a great advance, because it imposes discipline and gives place to the workforce. So it's very important to organize and discipline workers. But at the same time, he says you can't organize the rest of society in the way that you organize workers, because that would interfere with the active part of society, which is really the entrepreneurs. So whereas you can organize workers in some sense because they're like children, you can't organize the entrepreneur because that's of the vitality of capitalism. So that's interesting because he's, of course, therefore saying that organizing the workforce to keep their place is one thing, but you can't organize the bourgeoisie because they are the crucial organic and element that gives capitalism its power. So in this system, a spontaneous order arises, but that order is not the intended consequence of all the agents, but rather the unintended consequence of their acting on the knowledge at their disposal with the interests, their own interests in mind, within a framework of general rules that prescribe just conduct. Now it's interesting the term just conduct comes in here again, whereas he just finished saying that morals and fairness and all of that are childish, and in fact come from childish experience and nature. But this outcome of the market is full of uncertainty and has many ups and downs. As he said, the good may fail and the bad may succeed. And all you get from a market order is only a certain probability that expected relations will prevail, that many activities which depend on the dispersed knowledge can be effectively integrated into a single order, and that this outcome will produce some kind of balance in a kind of turbulent and erratic sense. What strikes me when I read this is the contrast to Marx's notion of how capitalism achieves its integrated order. And here, it's in volume 1 where he talks about how one of the characteristic features of capitalism is that every branch of labor and every activity within that branch is organized by individuals, capitalists, who have no idea of how it's going to work out, because each one of them in organizing something depends on the notion that others will be there when they need them. For instance, if you decide to set up a business, you have to assume that you will be able to buy the raw materials, that you'll be able to rent or buy a building, you'll be able to hire the workers. Workers will be themselves have to assume that they can get the food and shelter they want, that you'll be able to organize the labor process in a way that produces your outcome, that organization will succeed in producing a product which has value and surplus value embodied in it, and that you will succeed in selling it, which requires all the actions of all the buyers. Now that is a whole lot of presumption. And to emphasize that point, it's in volume 1, he gives the example of an entrepreneur who takes everything he needs to Australia, as I recall the story. He takes a boat full of workers, raw materials, anything he can procure there, machinery, basically the capital he needs, the money. And he sails to Australia, and after a long trip, they arrive there. And then he discovers that the presumption that everything will be there when you need it turns out to be not true. He doesn't get things he needs. He can get land, but the workers take off because they're suddenly in a place where they're not prohibited from owning land, and he's left with a lot of machinery and raw materials and nobody to produce them. And so the whole project fails. So that emphasis on the social requirement of individual labor being integrated into what he calls a social division of labor in Marx takes place through what he calls forcible articulation. That's a nice term, forcible articulation, because that implies that articulation breaks some elements, it creates spaces for others, it's turbulent, it's never quite right, and therefore constantly requires adjustments. And that is, in effect, Marx's version of Smith's invisible hand. The invisible hand comes through, as Marx puts it, the order comes in and through disorder. So you mustn't think of disorder as something inhibiting order. Disorder is the means of producing the order. And this is the point that Marx made. What's very interesting is Hayek says the same thing. He says, if you look at capitalism, some fail, others succeed, The balance is not immediate, but it is through this dynamic of collisions, so to speak, that capitalism achieves its great strength. Then there's the question of how, what does the market do? I'm going to skip this part and come back. What the market does, in Hayek's view, is determine the socially appropriate allocation of resources. Now, the term appropriate is important because he does not mean that it's optimal. In orthodox economics, you say is the optimal distribution of resources. He's not saying that. He's saying the distribution which is socially appropriate in the sense that it integrates these individual elements with social needs. That's pretty much what Marx says too. He says it's the social division of labor which asserts itself over the individual division of labor, but he's not saying that's a good division of labor. He's stating a fact about how capitalism operates. So that's another parallel that I found quite interesting. But then the Austrian school begins from the individual, as he says, as Hayek says, so Hayek's biographer says, the method that starts from individuals and their subjective valuations can discover the common principles that underlie all human societies. And you can immediately see the great contrast to Marx there, the idea that you start without talking about social structure or history or fundamentally about classes and about the different positions that people have in society, about power. And this is exactly what the Austrian school holds against Marx, that Marx does not begin from the individual and their subjective evaluations, but rather from some notion that they are created through society and their inherited human and biological traits are expressed differently in different societies. So Hayek's faith in the market allows him to accept as benign whatever evolves through the market. He defends the concentration of power. And he says large-scale companies are legitimate agents of the market process because they are, in fact, constrained by competition. So the idea that large-scale companies are monopoly is not true. However, he does believe that trade unions inhibit the proper operations of the system, and so they are monopolies. Now, that for me is very interesting also, because there's a parallel in Marx. Marx argues that concentration and centralization of capital intensifies capitalist competition. And I've always argued that. A good portion of my book is devoted to showing how that works in practice, empirically. But to give you some background, why do Marxists take the opposite point of view? If you look in the Marxist tradition in any discipline now, you'll find that 99% of them say that we are in a stage of monopoly capitalism. And that actually comes from Hilferding, but before that, from, I just blanked out, from his predecessors. I'll come back to that. And there the idea comes that this is because large-scale financial capitals and large-scale industrial capitals have now overthrown the laws of competition. Now, it's very interesting because Marx argued against that, but that is not known. And there's a reason, by the way, that it was not known. Volume 1 comes out, and then Volume 2 don't come out for 20 years. And Volume 3, which has got competition, comes out even later. So the Marxist tradition has already taken Volume 1 and run with it, so to speak. And there's little discussion of competition, in fact. It's mentioned, but it's not there. And the idea that prices reflect labor values is presented as a starting point, kind of in the same sense that Newton presents gravity without the presence of a fluid, so that everything falls at the same rate. It's an abstract beginning, but it becomes the end point also. And people don't read Volume 2 of Capital, which is admittedly a mess, and Volume 3, which is even a bigger mess. But contained there is a logic, and that's part of what my work has been doing, is to pull out that logic and show how absolutely powerful it is in modern capitalism, in the most developed capitalism. Uh, this notion of competition is important. Uh, if you look at big companies, you notice that they have a lot of power. They have political power. They have the power to influence people with their advertising and various enticement. But interestingly enough, they don't have the power to beat other big capitals. And this is the point of Marx, which is that concentration and centralization enhances the competition among big capitals also. I just read recently about how Walmart had started a service. I don't remember the service, I had to look it up, I forgot. But it was forced to withdraw from that because Amazon had got there first and they knew they wouldn't succeed. The competition with Amazon would have wiped them out. And you see this now on cars and iPhones. We think of Apple as dominating the world, but in fact, there's several iPhone manufacturers that have come up and they've taken a good portion of the market share away or maintained it. And all of these big companies are incessantly concerned with constantly innovating to lower costs, which is a fundamental feature of capitalism, of competition, because otherwise they will lose that branch and maybe they will lose altogether. I came into graduate school at a time when everybody said three things. One is the automobile industry is dominated by American capital and it's a world monopoly. Secondly, things like Kodak and Polaroid especially were absolutely dominated photography, another example of that. Well, nobody's ever heard of Polaroid anymore, nor Kodak for that matter. And American cars went through a very difficult period, rescued many times by the state, by the way, because they couldn't survive in competition. Same thing for industries. The deindustrialization of America was not a deindustrialization only, it was a reindustrialization in other parts of the world. And we can easily trace this because we know where those businesses went. They didn't go out, they moved. And they moved because they were more competitive, cost placed elsewhere. The other thing is that Hayek's account of accumulation is very similar, is similar in some respects to Marx, because he talks about it as not a process of balance or smoothness or optimality, but rather as a process that arises through this conflict of individual, all trying to do things, some of which are right, some of which are wrong. So it's a order and disorder notion. And what comes out of it is the growth of the system. Now, I don't know if Hayek actually emphasizes this other point, which comes from Marx. And Marx's idea that the capital is self-expanding value. That seems like a statement when you see it, you go, wow, that's really great. But it's actually more than just really great. It's fundamental to the understanding of capitalist competition, because the drive for self-expansion brings every capital into conflict with every other capital, because they're all trying to self-expand also. So within an industry, capitals compete with each other for selling the same product, fruit. And so doing, they have to distinguish themselves from others by better quality within some limits, but other people can adopt that too. And ultimately it comes down to the dominant thing, which is lower cost. Lower cost can mean working workers harder, longer, and paying them less wages, but that too is subject to competition in the sense that other capitalists can adopt that, and workers can organize and resist. So there's the active element in active and historic role of workers against the laws of the market. And in Hayek, that activity is something that will destroy the great benefit that capitalism provides. And so he's strongly opposed to unions and strongly opposed to labor activity. He sees workers as essentially docile or should be docile beings who are best handled by their capitals. And as I said before, this leads him to a problem, which is that other people don't seem to believe this. They don't seem to understand this. And so part of what society has to do is to educate them, to leave behind their intrinsically notions of social justice and fairness and so on, because these notions destroy the foundation of capitalist society. They impede it. And so by impeding it, they make it function less well. And so you have to fight against them. As he says, I think I quoted this before, the real dilemma is over what to teach the young, since many of them who are unworthy will succeed and many who are worthy will fail. Therefore, conventional morality has to be abandoned. In all of this idea that you have to abandon fairness and morality and the childlike or pre-modern notions that people should care about other people, he nonetheless accepts that the state has a role. And the role of the state, the first famous one in all of this tradition, is that it has to ensure reasonable security for all its citizens. And of course, that means enforce the laws of the market, enforce the laws of property, enforce a safety against depredations by other individuals. You need a criminal justice system, you need the police, you need the courts. But he also acknowledges that the state has to work to provide a level of floor below which individuals cannot sink. It's what I think of the Andrew Yang principle in Hayek, that everybody should have some foundational thing. And it's not clear why he says that, but I think his sense that if you don't provide that, you will fuel this socialist childlike nature of workers against the system, so you have to, in effect, prevent that by the law. So he says you have to provide minimum incomes, you have to improve opportunity and provide ways to improve opportunities for all citizens. That's not just to prevent them from attacking the system, but also to draw on the pool of potential entrepreneurs. So by improving these opportunities, you strengthen capitalism. But these have to be guided by the rule of law, and they cannot impose an artificial equality guided by notions of social justice. Again, you cannot rely on notions of equality and social justice. So he accepts also the need for government programs in housing, agriculture, and environment, but only when the market is not working. Now notice by so doing, he accepts that there are periodically failures of the market. I mean, Hayek comes about as an opponent of Keynes, as an alternative to Keynes, precisely at the time when the market has collapsed in the 1930s. And he presents himself as a pro-market mathematical economist, because his work at that time was really more in models of money and business cycles. And Keynes demolishes him, really wipes him out. Keynes has one of his own posse, Piero Sraffa, who was a legendary figure in, I teach a course on Sraffa for the last 20 years. Sraffa is like one of those figures approach with caution, because it's like Hegel. It's easy to get lost, but there's a lot there. And he gets Sraffa to write a devastating criticism of Hayek, and Hayek is never able to deal with that. So Hayek accepts the idea of market failure, but he never dwells on it. He knows the reality. But then the question is, why did it fail? And later on in this whole tradition, it comes about the argument that it failed because governments had intervened. Had they not intervened, they wouldn't have this failure. Milton Friedman, for instance, famously said that the whole problem with the Great Depression was not the depression part, because cycles are normal, was that the state acted improperly in the financial sector, and by so doing, it caused the downturn to spread into a depression. And Ben Bernanke, the head of the Federal Reserve for 10 years, is on record saying that's absolutely correct. We all know that the crisis comes about because the improper actions of the state. But Hayek is totally opposed to the idea of a welfare state, because it leads to the redistribution of incomes based on some notion of social justice. And he's completely opposed to the idea of social justice, because that's going to ultimately lead to the failure of capitalism or the dissolution of capitalism. And for the same reason, he's opposed to progressive taxation. I don't think he's opposed to taxation, but it should be not discriminate against those who have more money. Here there's an interesting, and I started with the story, the Swedish Central Bank Prize, but I want to connect this back up. The Swedish Central Bank Prize arose because central bankers, who by their nature are extremely right-wing and conservative, were increasingly troubled by the fact that the welfare state was seen, that the Swedish model was viewed as a good model of capitalism, and was spreading not only in Scandinavia, but in England and Germany, less so in the US, but its spread was like the virus that we're talking about today. And they wanted to act to combat that spread. So these central bankers went to the Swedish liberal welfare state government and asked them for a fund of money for research. And the government gave it to them, and they immediately turned around and made it the Central Bank Prize, which was then used to greatly enhance and stimulate the reach of market worship economics. So there's, and of course, we know that Hayek in fact received this Central Bank Prize himself, and that absolutely changed his life, because after he went up against Keynes and was destroyed by that, theoretically, mathematically, empirically, he retreated and had a coterie of people around him, always rich and central banker types, though Milton Friedman was one of those initially. But he was then resurrected by that prize. He went from being obscure and forgotten in economics to becoming a central figure, because it gave him the authority. And again, as an economist, I should say that this is something of great concern to all of us in my department, because we're outside of this domain. Nobody in the Nobel list has ever gotten a prize for being a non-heterodox economist. You get a prize sometimes for being a progressive economist, but it's like saying that you gave, the Vatican gave a bishopness, is there such a word, dukeness, a bishopness, to someone who was a Protestant or a Muslim. Is it not going to happen? Because the purpose of the Vatican is to shore up that tradition. And the Swedish Central Bank is the Vatican of economics. It is, however, unlike Catholicism, dominant everywhere. Even in China, as I said before, I went to Chile. After all that had happened in Chile, you would think there would be some memory of the progressive fight against capitalism. There is none in economics. It's been obliterated completely. So the next point is Hayek on neoclassical economics. I've gone longer than I said, but I think I should be able to end within an hour or so. And one of the things Austrians do is they reject most of neoclassical economics. Neoclassical economics has a vision of capitalism that came from Leon Walras, and that is a vision of capitalism achieving balance smoothly and immediately. I won't go into that, but that's called general equilibrium, and it has now become the mathematical foundation of all economic analysis in the neoclassical tradition. What's interesting is Walras himself did not believe that. He was a socialist who said that the state was required to make capitalism function properly, but now Walras' notion of general equilibrium is dominant in not only academic life, in economics department, but even corporations. They often talk about this vision. But Hayek rejects that notion. He rejects the notion of equilibrium and order as a result of this sort of what Walras calls tâtonnement, this small adjustments that brings everything to the right place. He says individuals undertake what they do dependent on the information available to them. Many times they're wrong. Many times good individuals get defeated and bad ones succeed. So this idea of this optimality is something he rejects completely. And therefore, he also rejects the notion of perfect knowledge, which is central to neoclassical economics. As I said, the idea of rational expectations is an extension of perfect knowledge to the future. It's stochastic perfect knowledge. In fact, he says mainstream economics could be used to support socialist conclusions because it rejects the notion of the turbulence and blood that takes place in the movement to the market. And he was right about that because Lange and Lerner turned the tables on Hayek and von Mises and said, look, a computer could do all these calculations, gather all the information and calculate the prices. And so the notion that you need a market to do it locally in all this erratic way is superseded by the notion that socialism could do it. And that was a powerful argument. It was not a good argument, in my opinion, because it tied them to the basic premise of the ideal system, which neoclassical economics was putting forward. So for this reason, since he rejects the perfect knowledge and optimality, he rejects his notion of market efficiency in the static sense. You could say that he supports the idea of market efficiency in some dynamic evolutionary sense. The market wins over other things, even though it might be red in tooth and claw. It wins because it is better, but not because it is in some static sense efficient or optimal. In fact, he says the market is an imperfect instrument like all human institutions because there's uncertainty and ignorance, but is less imperfect than any available alternative and certainly less imperfect than socialism. And a crucial feature which he emphasizes, which Schumpeter later picks up, is the idea that the market functions as a discovery process in which people try different ways to satisfy the needs of consumers, and sometimes they're right and sometimes wrong, but this evolutionary discovery process is what makes the market, so what makes capitalism so strong. And I'm almost at the end. I'm not going to talk about socialism because that whole debate is fairly well known, though I could talk about that if you're interested. But he also says, therefore, he believes in methodological individualism, because all analysis of social reality must start from individuals, conceived as self-sufficient, fixed entities, confronting the external world, and then responding to opportunities and constraints by making choices and devising strategies. So that's the starting point of orthodox economics also. But where he departs from that is the idea that these individuals know and that they're correct and the results are optimal. He doesn't say that. He says this clash of individual intentions and the actual outcomes produces a better set of outcomes than any regulated society. And he denies for this reason any notion of a collectivity. A social collectivity has no existence and no reality beyond the actions of individual members. So to say that you have a collective that has its own character or will is wrong. They're all abstractions and they're only composed of individuals. And then he introduces a notion of value, very fundamental to both Hayek and von Mises, the idea that what markets do, what firms do, is produce value for individuals because they give them things that they want, and that is value. And this can only be known through the behavior and choices in the free market of the individuals. You can guess, you can try, but you might be wrong because your idea is too early. You might be wrong because you're beaten by a nastier person who's dishonest, but whatever it is, there's no guarantee that you succeed. I always tell students in my courses that something like 50% of businesses fail in good years, not now, which is huge, but 50% fail in the best of times within 6 or 7 years. People forget that starting a business doesn't mean that you will succeed. In fact, many good businesses fail and many bad businesses succeed. And that's Hayek's point. Uh, this implies that capitalism must serve the preferences of individuals, but now you see this contradiction. He has already argued that you have to extinguish those preferences and behaviors which try to emphasize freedom, fairness, and because those are childish and pre-modern. So evidently here he means that you have to, it serves the preferences of individuals as long as they're purged of their socialist instincts that they inherit as children from the family and their culture. Now, the last point. When we speak of costs in orthodox economics, there are two senses of costs. One is the cost of producing something. If you make a piece of steel, a ton of steel, there's a cost associated with it, and that cost is going to affect the price that you can sell it for if you're successful, which has to be bigger than the cost and should have a profit rate that you can accept. And if the profit rate is lower than other activities, you will leave the steel behind, or at least some people will leave the steel behind and move to where the profit rate is higher. Conversely, if the profit rate is higher, then new capitals will begin to crowd in and they will lower the profit rate by increasing the supply. This is the basic principle of arbitrage in Smith and plays a big role in Marx. And the result of that is to create a turbulent equalization of profit rates around each other. Not inequality, but a whole movement. And in my book, I actually show the empirical movements of the sort, up and down, what Marx calls a cycle of lean and fat years for every industry. Sometimes it's in the doldrums, sometimes it's in the heights, but it goes back and forth because of this process. And when talking about costs, Marx is mostly talking about real costs, objective costs. The one instance which we know, Smith, Ricardo, and Marx agree that cost has no basis for the price is of goods which are not reproducible. And this goes back to Adam Smith. It's in Ricardo, the first chapter of Ricardo, and Marx mentions it again also in the beginning, which is that those goods which are not reproducible, like rare wines or paintings of great masters or anything from the past which are collectible and are valued only because they are from the past, these things will have a price only dependent on their scarcity and the price that people are willing to pay for them. My wife is an art historian, and she has more than once seen paintings in different places be discovered. And if they're from a dead painter, that generally helps, because that means that you cannot produce any more paintings, and therefore they become scarce, and the price of paintings can shoot up as long as you can convince some rich people to buy them, whether they're good or bad. I've never been convinced that Jackson Pollock is a great figure, but anyway, he is dead. And the number of paintings, except those which have been forged, goes up according to the preferences and money of rich people. So that was known and is emphasized right from the beginning. The second part is the cost is objective. But there's a third element, which is not the cost as objective, but as an alternative. That's the element that Hayek emphasizes. He says cost should represent opportunities foregone, alternative choices not taken in order to use money in a different way. That's correct in the sense that it is benchmark, but it doesn't mean that it's what it costs to make something. And it's interesting that Marx comes to exactly the same point when he talks about what motivates accumulation of capital. And here Marx says something very interesting. Again, this is in volume 3 and is often not picked up, but he does say it quite a few times, and it's very central because Keynes says the same thing. He says, look, investment is motivated by the prospect of a profit rate. Doesn't mean you get it. Half of you won't get it, as a matter of fact. Half of you will lose money, not even make the normal profit rate. So you go there with the expectation of a profit rate. But how do you know whether it was worth it? And he says that what you do is you make a judgment. What businesses do is make a judgment if the expected profit rate is higher than the thing that they could get with security. That's the interest rate. If I put my $100 million in a bond or the bank or whatever, I get a guaranteed interest rate or get a secure interest rate. If I put it into a plant, I don't know whether in 5 years I'll be one of the people still alive or one of the people lost it all. So he calls the difference between the expected profit rate and the interest rate, which he touts as a benchmark. It's not because you borrow the money. It's because it's the hurdle, as he puts it, that you have to jump. He calls that difference profit of enterprise, the profit rate of enterprise, because that's the part that accrues to taking the risk and trying to produce and realize surplus value. And it's very interesting that Keynes says the same thing, and Hayek is reducing the two by saying that your profit is only what your next alternative is, which is the common trope in orthodox economics. Marx is not saying that. Surplus value and surplus product is an objective outcome of production of value and production of surplus value, and your share in competition. But nonetheless, you have to know whether that outcome, it justifies your continuation. And if it doesn't, then you stop. Okay, on that basis, I should stop and open it up to any discussions, questions, clarifications, whatever you want.
Yeah, let me start us off. This is really interesting, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Though I think some of the things that you say you won't talk about are probably of big interest here, and I think the idea that we already know, for example, how to evaluate, say, Hayek's views of socialism and so on. Well, I doubt that this is generally true in this group, and it's definitely not true for me. But let me put my interest in terms of a question and a comment. And the comment is that it's interesting how in the tradition of the economic greats, in the whole panoply of the major figures, you seem to have a great deal of respect for three rather different economists with probably somewhat different assumptions, but certainly very different social philosophies, namely Marx, Keynes, and Hayek. And I'm kind of interested in how all that works out in terms of your own ideas. But let me put this in terms of something more concrete. And there is therefore a Marx Hayek question that I want to ask, and then a very simple Keynes Hayek question too. The Marx Hayek question is the following. I mean, you seem to indicate in the presentation that on a lot of points they converge. I would say probably you think that they converge more with each other than with what you call the neoclassical orthodoxy, which has, of course, a lot of figures within it. That's kind of interesting, right? Because that's not ordinarily how many of us think of it. But let's assume that you demonstrated that. Then the question really is, but how can then their evaluation be so different on an issue like socialism? Because after all, in terms of relation to socialism, Friedman and Hayek are a lot closer to each other than either one would be to Marx. And of course, probably a lot of other names could have been mentioned, Mises too, and so on in that context. So how is that possible? And is it because you're dealing with Hayek on two levels? One is the ultimate social philosophical assumptions, and the other is the analysis of the workings, the very realistic analysis of the workings of capitalism, which I think could mean that it's because of the ultimate anthropological and philosophical, social philosophical assumptions that he's so different than Marx on on the question of beyond capitalism, namely socialism. And that, of course, would still leave open the question of how, at least according to most treatments, the logic of capitalism leads to a socialist possibility, which it does not, apparently, in Hayek. So that's my first question. The second one I said will be much simpler. Several times you mentioned that Keynes, and I think you had Sraffa too in mind, have devastated Hayek in their debates. And you don't really say how that was done and on what issues. And I think I would be interested, certainly, in hearing that. That's the Keynes Hayek question. The Marx Hayek question was the other one. So I stop on this. So let's start with this, and then after that we'll open it to the rest of the class.
Okay, so let me start with the second question. After the Great Depression, the capitalist world was really devastated. And orthodox economics of that time had proposed exactly what it had done since Ricardo onward, which is that if you let the market work, the unemployment and poverty and misery of that period would go. And that the only reason it didn't is because the state was interfering. Now, that was a very hard argument to support in the 1930s, given what was happening in Europe and given the fact that every year the orthodoxy was wrong. And you could see the rising force against capitalism, fascism, or socialism. And Keynes argued and proposed that this was an intrinsic possibility in capitalism. That was anathema to these people, because from them, it only could happen from something from the outside. And he went on to try to construct, and it was a difficult process for him because he was one of them before he switched sides, the notion that you need, that capitalism can get stuck in its floor, and you need something to move it out. And in his earlier notions of this, politically he was very active. He said, only half in jest, actually more in seriousness, look, if you give people money, they will spend it. And if they spend it, other people will have ability to hire people. So you need to get that injection in first. And one way, which he proposed in an article, was a newspaper article. He said, let's just bury money in mines and tell people in some mines there's money and they can go and start searching for that. But in order to do that, they'll have to be employed by capitalists in order to look for the mines. So it's like looking for gold, right? Some will win, some will not. But win or not, people have to be paid, and that'll stimulate the economy. Later on, he moves that notion forward a bit by proposing that, again, half seriously, that every capitalist country in the midst of this depression should drop money from an airplane over the population, because the population could then get the money, spend it, and when they spend it, the people they spend it on would have money to spend on, and this is a multiplier process in Keynes's famous notion. Actually, it's Kahn's famous notion, and that would stimulate the economy. Now, while he was saying all of this, capitalist economies were not doing it, and his own book was actually not very well received. Strong base thought that book was, Italian economists thought it was very weird and wrong because it went against these fundamental principles. Yet at that time, as Hitler was beginning to rise in power, his finance minister, Schacht, had already put into practice what is called the first version of military Keynesianism. Deficit financed expenditures, which greatly expanded employment, so much so that within a year or 2 years, there was full employment. Yeah, military employment, but there was full employment. And this was a validation of Keynes's argument. But I have a long story here, so I need to just pause for a minute. The validation. In World War II, every capitalist country did the same thing. The US budget deficit was 27%. It's never been seen before in any capitalist country. And guess what? Full employment. In fact, they needed more people. They needed women to come in. They needed Black people to come in. They needed young people to come in. They didn't have enough people. So if this was the answer, then obviously the orthodoxy was doomed, because here it worked. And so in the 1950s, Keynesians, and this, by the way, devastated people like Hayek, who was saying, no, you can't interfere, the state will make things worse, because here's proof. It solves the problem that could have destroyed capitalism itself. In the 1960s, in the 50s and 60s, Keynesians were dominant. And they were dominant because of these events. As Kalecki says, military Keynesianism in Germany worked, war Keynesianism worked, and they applied the same policies. But Hayek had said that if you apply these policies when the system is not in trouble, you'll get increasing unemployment and you'll get inflation. And he says precisely the following: you will stimulate the economy, but the unemployment will come back, and you'll stimulate the economy more, and as you get more stimulus, you'll have more and more inflation, and you won't be able to maintain the desired level of employment. Now, the Keynesians believed that you could do that because the theory inherited from Keynes didn't have any limit until you reach full employment. What happened is what Hayek predicted. What Hayek predicted. You got inflation and you got slowing of growth, and this is the famous period called stagflation. Now, in my own work, I attempt to provide an explanation for that, which is different from Hayek's, which is that you were interfering in a system which will find its own level, because we already know that's not true. I point out that in Germany and in the US, and indeed in every war economy, they did three other things. They banned, because that was again, they banned wage increases because that's undermining the war effort by raising costs, and they fixed the interest rate low so the state could borrow. So what they did is they cut the feedback loop between stimulus and the market reaction of raising prices, raising wages, raising the interest rate, which would all then lead to other problems. But they didn't think of that in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, because in their theory, there was no such feedback loop. And so they applied it. In my own argument and the empirical evidence and so on, and applied to Brazil under Lula and all of that, neglecting this leads you to what looks like a pseudo-Hayekian conclusion. Because what you're neglecting is what Marx argued, which is that capitalism cannot go without sufficient profit. And if you begin to interfere in the profit, then you'll get consequences that look like they're the results of capitalist reactions, but they're not intentional. They're the automatic results of the feedback of capitalism. So here, Hayek comes back as the great sage, not only of socialism, which he said would collapse under its own weight because it's an non-viable system, but also here in capitalism, you will produce this. And the person who inherited the win there was Friedman. Friedman, at least in one biography I read, was originally a socialist. He came from a New York Jewish tradition where socialism was pretty well embedded. And then he became a Keynesian, because again, this was stated, application of the idea that you can choose social thing. And then he became essentially a Hayekian. And in that third personality, he became immensely successful because he provided an explanation, a neoclassical explanation, of why Keynesianism failed. Sorry for the long answer, but it's theoretically very important. Why did it fail, according to Friedman? Because Friedman says, look, you Keynesians are going in and saying there's a 10% unemployment rate. So of course we have to stimulate because all those people are without jobs. The mistake you made is that those people are not unemployed. They are choosing not to work because you gave them welfare and unemployment insurance. So they are voluntarily unemployed. And then you cannot get rid of them by stimulating, because the stimulus goes hand in hand with these other things, and you recreate, you try to lower unemployment below what they are. It's a temporary thing because they don't need to work. And so therefore you get, the growth rate comes back down. So the stimulus leads to inflation. Now, I argue that this is exactly the point, not because there's full employment, because the feedback loop was not cut any longer. And then you get effect on profitability. What I can show in my book is what happens in that period. The profit rate falls. When it falls, growth rate slows down. Unemployment pops back up. Then the Keynesians rush in and say, oh, we need to stimulate more. They do that. Unemployment rate falls. Wages share rises. Then profit rate falls more. This argument is, interestingly, chapter 25 of volume 1 in Marx, The Reserve Army of Labor. When you look at that chapter, you have to ask yourself, why is there a reserve army of labor? I mean, capitalism is growing. Why doesn't it grow to the point where there's full employment? How can Marx ground the idea that there is something that recreates it? His answer is that if growth continues to the point where it's approaching this full employment, wages will begin to rise. As wages rise faster than productivity, the profit share will fall, the profit rate will fall, that will slow growth down, which will unemploy or disemploy some of those workers. Secondly, as wages rise, the incentive for mechanization rises. So that'll displace workers. So in those brief sections of chapter 25, he lays out an argument for limits, which don't come from full employment. On the contrary, they preserve a certain level of unemployment that the system, he says, needs towards accumulation. So that means that in the debate with Keynes and Hayek, Keynes himself says, I don't mean this to be applied in good times, but anyway, Keynes is right that you can stimulate the system. Hayek is right that this will have effects that will cause employment inflation. But I would argue that they both have in common that this effect comes about at full employment. And in fact, it doesn't come about at full employment. It comes about when the reserve army gets too small, so to speak. And that's because there is a feedback loop. And that brings me back to my original point. The reason it worked in war economies is that war economies give you the right, the social collective right, to stop capitalism from doing what it normally does. And the reason it doesn't work in other times, including Brazil under Lula, is that you don't have that right to stop that. So that's my own reading of why Keynes smashed Hayek in the early days when Hayek was arguing that capitalism would come back. And Hayek smashed Keynes in the later days when Keynesian policy was applied and Hayek seems to come back. It's a very interesting dynamic there. In that, I would think that Marx would have been more on Keynes' side about the need to intervene and on Hayek's side about the consequences. Then the first question you asked, Andrew, was the convergence of Hayek and Keynes. So that's a little bit artificial because I emphasize that. I was trying
Hayek and Marx.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I said, Marx and Hayek. I emphasize that because it's not normally brought out. Hayek didn't ever read Marx. Von Mises did and attacked Marx, but Hayek had the wonderful ability to ignore what other people had written. His theory of business cycles was apparently the same as that of Wicksell, but that's not because he might have read Wicksell, but it's more likely that it was because he reinvented Wicksell and people thought he didn't do it as well as the original writing. So as an economist, he was not very successful. His work was impenetrable. It was destroyed by Truffa and Keynes. But when he came back was his vision of the superiority of capitalism as this dynamic and ruthless system. And that has, of course, endeared him to the Koch brothers, to people in the boardrooms who believe that they came up at the top because they are the best. Hayek doesn't actually say that. He says they came up to the top because they came up to the top. They could be the worst, but they happened to get there. But they, of course, like to believe that they're the best. And in his later life, he sort of did switch over. As he got more accolades and more money and all of that, it's natural for him to consider himself part of the best.
Okay, so now...
One other thing, I'm sorry, I forgot this. It's very, very crucial. So I emphasize the similarities, but I hinted at the differences. The difference has to do with the role of the working class. Hayek sees workers essentially as docile beings, or should be docile beings, because if they know their place, they will be in a system that will make them better off, historically. So he doesn't see them as having agency, or he sees them as they should not have agency. That's why unions are bad. That's why struggles of socialism are bad, because they disrupt capitalism. And so the role of the worker and the vision of the working class, the view of the working class, is one fundamental difference in the two, absolutely fundamental. And from that point of view, socialism as the place where finally the working class achieves power and liberates itself from the history of subordination is the Marxist vision. In Hayek, it's the dictatorship of the working class in another sense, dictation of the mentality that you have to have everything fair and right, and it'll ultimately lead to actual dictatorship.
So we will open up the floor now to the rest of the class.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Professor Shaikh, for the this insightful presentation, especially in this critical moment that we're living in, and that has necessarily some economic implications in it. My question seems more like a general reflection about the discipline of economics. Do you think we need to reflect on the definition of economics? Should we still consider economics as a science, or more as a political argument? Do you think economics became too broad as a topic, and that so many are involved, and do you think there's a lot of mathematics involved in it that blur the vision of how economics is involved in our world? My second question is, again, Marx and Hayek debates, and this is also, if Professor Arato can say something about it, is the question of democracy and economics. And since, well, what I have in mind is the libertarian view of Hayek versus the class, or majorly the separation into class of society makes the democracy question a little bit well, kind of crucial in this debate, because what Hayek says is let the market, let the economy is too complex to try to explain it. So let the market figure this out by itself. But how about democracy and all of that?
Okay, let me start with the first one because it's still about Hayek. Hayek holds a libertarian view, excuse me, in some sense, but he's also careful to say that the sense in which he holds it is that people should be allowed to try, but not that they should expect to succeed, and that they have to accede to the sometimes brutal process in which they attempt. And when the they he's talking about is really the bourgeoisie. He's not talking about workers. Workers should know their place and should accept their place because they are operating under the guidance of a I won't say superior, though it's very much in the guidance of let's say, more active and more enlightened set of people. So in that sense, democracy includes all kinds of things, but I'm sorry, in that sense, the libertarian view is opposed to the class view, and he said so explicitly, because it tries to attribute to people a set of characteristics which don't exist. He does say elsewhere, and I didn't elaborate on that, he does say the big trouble with capitalism is that most people are not entrepreneurs, and what he means by that, most people are workers. And he says at some point, capitalism would be great if you didn't have such people. And that raises a very interesting question, how you could have capitalism without workers. but he sees them as dangerous and in a sense necessary, but another sense would be great if they weren't necessary. So the democracy part. The real question that comes about is the democracy for whom? And again, Hayek has repeatedly said that he thinks that most people are like children. You know, he says the socialist impulse comes from children. You have to, in effect, get them. He doesn't quite say beat it out of them, but you have to take it out of them in order for them to be successful in this new society. In this, and by the way, he says the best of all possible society. I didn't dwell on that part, but he says this society arose through eons of social evolution, and it is now the highest stage. There is no other stage possible. So for that reason, he's opposed to any ideas of socialism, because that presumes that there can be a better stage. And this is the best stage. Then from that point of view, the notion of class as either constitutive of previous societies or capitalism is already a big error, because it misunderstands the true nature of capitalism, that it gives everybody who is willing to do it a chance without guaranteeing anything. And that's consistent with his view. Now, obviously, Marx is coming from a somewhat different starting point, from the observation of society, the existence of power and inequality, especially the fundamental role of class in all of, at least, post-hunting-gathering society. From that point of view, you start with the individual as socially situated, and you do not say that their desire for justice and equality is something that needs to be taken out of them because it's going to cause problems in society. On the contrary, it becomes developed into the basis of solidarity and political and social action towards the goal of developing a post-capitalist society. And Hayek is very aware of this post-capitalist society notion. I mean, it's coming about after long debates and the rise of the Russian Revolution, the rise of the Soviet Union. So it's not like he's unfamiliar with it. He just believes that any attempt there would lead to terrible outcomes, including subordination to power and a dictatorship. And in that sense, he was greatly enhanced in his reputation with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of China, for that matter. Let me talk about economics. You know, I frequently find that people talk about economics, and I feel like Tonto in the famous instance where Lone Ranger and Tonto are surrounded, and Lone Ranger says, "I guess we're done for." And Tonto says, "Who do you mean, us, paleface?" And so I feel very much like that. When you talk about economics, you're not talking about the economics of hundreds of, thousands of us, maybe 100,000 of us across the globe, who do not subscribe to the idea that economics should be measured by its mathematics, or that its conception is that of a asocial individual. I teach all of my courses beginning in the same way. Development of society, talking about the social situation and the situation of individuals in society and how that influences them, race, class, gender, ethnicity, and so on, because I want to counter the idea that there's some natural individual. But then you also have to explain what the orthodoxy explains. You can't just say, well, it's political. How are you going to explain demand and supply? How do you explain prices? How do you explain exchange rates? How about interest rates? How about the effects that Keynes was concerned with, macroeconomic policies? Those are detailed explanations of real processes. That's why I would argue that understanding what went wrong with the application of Keynesian policies in the 50s and 60s is not merely because they were not politically wise, it's because their economics was wrong. And I draw here on an economics that Marx develops. And that raises another question. Why did Marx spend so much of his life, 40 years, trying to write on economics? I went to a seminar on methodology, and I asked the students, they hadn't discussed it. They were all talking about Marx, alienation, politics, philosophy. And I said, what about his economics? And it was blank. And I said, you know, Marx spent 40 years of his life writing economics, which was his most precious thing, as he himself says, his beloved work in economics. And someone looked around, no one had, and then one person raised their hand and said, well, maybe he was trying to impress the orthodox economists. No, if that's what Marx is reduced to on our side, then we're in deep shit. Because we forget that capitalism has, in my opinion, strong operative patterns. I don't want to call them laws because people think that they're supernatural or super historical. They're specific to capitalism. That was Marx's point. That's what Marx calls laws of motion. And he doesn't use the word law lightly, by the way. He sees these patterns, and these patterns were already known to Smith and Ricardo, and they are well established empirically, and we have to explain them. We have to explain why business cycles, growth, unemployment, inflation, exchange rates, all of those patterns which are so central to our understanding what happens when we intervene. You cannot understand how to build a rocket to go from here to the moon. And by the way, going from here to socialism is a lot more complicated than going from here to Mars if you don't understand physics. And what you do not want to do is press buttons on the grounds that this button looks good. That ain't gonna work. So I believe that if people are politically active, they have to understand what they're doing about the system that they're acting against. And I think that was what Marx dedicated his whole life to, his stupendous effort that he spent in the British Library studying how capitalism works. We really have to do that. And I want to tell parenthetically one little thing. I went to a conference in Manchester, which was a typical kind of conference I'm invited to. Heterodox economists all talking about business, different things. And it pretty much, I could see that what they're talking about is stuff I'd already heard in many other dozens of other conferences. So a group of us slipped out and we went to the Museum of Labor in Manchester, and we went to a library called Chatham Library. Now, in Chatham Library, I don't know, have anybody gone to Chatham Library in Manchester? It's really cool. If you, after the plague, you should try to look at it. There's a bay, an area which is a bay window, and it's got all these wonderful cross little patterns of glass, and you can look out over a garden. And there's a table. And at the table, there are some books. And on the table, there's a plaque. There's a plaque that says, this is where Marx and Engels sat when they wrote the Communist Manifesto. Now, I'm not a religious person, but I got a thrill, which is as close as a person like me can get to a feeling of being in touch with a history that was really important, crucial. And these two young men didn't have to do it. They could have stayed philosophers. They were fundamentally powerful political activists. Why spend your life doing that? I think it's because understanding capitalism is a very important political task. And so that I've dedicated 40 years of my life, more than that actually, to that task of understanding Marx's economic analysis in order to make it applicable to the modern world. And not as a piece. Many Marxists do this. They pick up alienation, they pick up exploitation, they pick up the transformation problem, they pick up some other thing, primitive accumulation, they pick up, of course, Marxist philosophy, but they never put it together. And I think one has to oppose that. I'm not a political activist anymore. I spent enough of my life doing that, but I think it's necessary. So anyway, long-winded answer. I think the discipline of economics is very powerful, and I don't think it's anything to do with math. If you have a really bad vision of capitalism, you can cover it up with mathematics in the same way that a Catholic priest can cover up the vision, absurd vision of heaven and the Garden of Eden by speaking in Latin. It's our Latin. But if you understand it, it fools nobody. On the other hand, math is frequently, or sometimes, let me say sometimes, very useful to solve problems and to understand the real process. I can talk about that, perhaps it's not necessary here, but at least 4 of us in the department are working on mathematical tools in order to explain persistent observable patterns, which are quite extraordinary and appear in every capitalist country, but are not so easy to understand without some tools. That's called, by the way, econophysics. If you want to look at it, my homepage has many articles on that. The way we describe it is not that hard because the math is in the back.
I mean, you asked about the similarity of the Marx and Hayek, and in a way, Professor Shaikh said at the end of his discussion, said some things that I want to kind of elaborate upon his sayings. Professor Shaikh said that Hayek considers people as children. I mean, yeah, I mean, in a way, it's right. But here is the problem of ideology comes. Even in Marxian view, I mean, ideology as a sort of false consciousness appears, and we have people who don't understand what's really going on in, as you said, in Marxian economics or anything else. I mean, this is the similarity between Marx and Hayek. Both don't believe in a kind of liberal, classic liberal kind of democracy, which believes that people vote, people know, people have information, people have, I mean, this kind of thing. This is the similarity. And from this similarity, problems arise. And the main problem is that, I mean, yes, political economy is very important, but why, I mean, Hayekian people like Thatcher, I mean, succeeded where, I mean, socialists failed. So this is the thing that Andrew asked. What is the similarity between Hayek and Marx? They both believe in a kind of utopia because they don't accept the existing reality at all. And in his famous essay, Intellectuals and Socialism, Hayek, in his very Leninistic, I mean, very Leninist essay, talked about how we can make people to the cause of liberalism. He didn't, I mean, mention the role of the party, but he mentioned this sort of think tanks and media, including radio, television, universities, and all the things that Althusser calls ideological state apparatus. I mean, he wanted from people to devote their life to, I mean, attract people in these institutions to the cause of neoliberalism or liberalist ideas. So this is a kind of similarity that I mean, they and Marxists have in common. I mean, to transcend this society, to transcend the liberal society. But how? Professor Shaikh, I mean, didn't mention the concept of rules because it's very, I mean, important in Hayek's philosophy. Following Wittgenstein, Hayek said that spontaneous order consists in a kind of practical dealing of people with nature. And there developed a kind of rules that, I mean, reached the end of the history, which is capitalist society. People must obey these rules in order to, I mean, live properly. This is very like a kind of Stalinist conception of history. As you said, Professor Shaikh, Marx just, I mean, described a definite kind of society.
It's interesting what you mentioned about the similarities of Marx and Hayek. Obviously, I'm emphasizing some similarities, and obviously not others. But you said that Hayek considers people as children. I think that's not quite right. Obviously, doesn't consider the bourgeoisie as children. He considers workers as children, and there's a big difference. And the interesting thing there is he considers children as socialists. So when he considers people, in that sense, he says that people, especially not people, but workers especially, have an intrinsic tendency towards justice and are therefore childlike from his point of view. And he abhors that. He doesn't say, you know, that you can get away with it. It's part of human nature. It's part of history. He doesn't quite put it that way. It's part of socialism, of evolution. But nonetheless, it's wrong because it inhibits this society. I heard you say, so therefore, from his point of view, socialism is wrong because it is constructed on this true basis of human feelings, but that true basis is inappropriate for a society that is the best of all possible worlds.
People, Hayek said people are intrinsically socialist. He says
No, he said children, not people, children.
Because of the, widespread of a socialist idea, people are socialists. Hayek doesn't interested, in a kind of intrinsic qualities of human being. As you said, he considered, human being as a kind of practical dealer with nature and with themselves. There's no intrinsic to human.
No, I disagree with that completely. These are quotes from Hayek. Hayek speaks about the fact that the problem is that children are socialist by, they bring up, you have to be in a family, you have to care about your parents have to care about you, so you're already brought up, so to speak.
It's a metaphor.
As a socialist.
It's a metaphor.
No, I don't think it's a metaphor. It's a reality. You know, it's not very hard to establish this biologically. We share a huge amount of what we do with our inheritance from biology, including the necessity to bring up human children to a point where they can stand on their own 2 feet. That's obvious, a trivial point. So in that sense, that network of family and language, by the way, which children are not born with, and knowledge and all of that is an environment in which they're shaped and they're nurtured. And he understands that totally. He was shaped himself that way. I presume if he had children, he did the same thing. So the problem for him is that leads to a kind of notion that fairness and caring for others and all of that are qualities that you should strive for. He doesn't say for all, but it's a quality that socialism feeds on, the idea of socialism feeds on. And that's wrong. Because you should instead, as they get older, get this idea out of their head and get them to learn to be true warriors. Now, it's very interesting, that parallel about warriors, because this is exactly the mentality of every military camp. Boot camp is about getting you away from this idea of dependence and caring for others and learning to obey orders. Hayek does not say this about entrepreneurs.
So I have 2 questions. I hope the first one will be quick. The first one is, doesn't Hayek's system kind of devolve for workers into a type of caste system? So wouldn't they have social reproduction in a caste-like system? And what would happen to mobility? And then the second question is, what about the spending power, especially in the domestic consumer market? If there is this kind of reproductive caste system, can the proletariat, if we can call it that, or the working class, even pay into the normal market system?
Okay, let me start with the first one. It's a very interesting fact when you look at work on inequality and the study of mobility of labor. And the people who do that is Piketty and Saez, Emmanuel Saez at Berkeley. You can click on his webpage. He has many articles. And one of the points he makes is that despite the whole ideology that anybody can rise to the top, the number of people who escape the class of their parents is very small. And of course, there are people from the top who fall down. So the preserved structure of inequality is not very variable, but the people who occupy the place vary to some extent. And we have a lot of evidence on this. And I started to say that I do work on inequality. So let me explain why I got interested in that work. There is a physicist by the name of Viktor Yakovenko, who was born in Russia. And he began to look at economic patterns of inequality, which physicists don't normally do. They look at something else, and economists don't normally look at physics. But he discovered something quite striking, that if you rank all workers, or people who wage and salary income, which is basically 97% of the population, you find that their distribution of income follows a fixed pattern. And that pattern is the same in every year. And that's called an exponential distribution. And you can show this very easily graphically, and I do in my papers. So by just plotting it on a certain scale, it's a straight line. Then he shows that in every year for which we have data, it's a straight line. His co-workers have shown it in every capitalist country, it's a straight line. Now, when I, as an economist, see that, I go, that's stunning, and we have to have an explanation for it, right? So the first paper I did with some students was to see, I assumed it was not true by class and gender. Because, I mean, we know that, speaking of caste, race and gender, we know that race and gender are special castes, so to speak, and therefore we expect that the distribution will not be the same. But it was the same. The difference is that women's wages were lower, and black wages were lower than whites, but the shape was just the same. And that leads to a question: how can it be that this is an outcome that nobody chooses, nobody enforces, and yet you get a pattern? And the only answer is that this is the result of the capitalist market, the workings of the labor market and capitalism. And so I've been doing this now for 5 years. I got into the mathematics of it. You can show, and ultimately I was able to show, with the help of a wonderful student, who's now graduated, we were able to show that you can derive this pattern from an argument in Smith and Marx. And the reason is that Smith and Marx, I'm sorry to be so economics, but it's so fundamental. This is a real pattern about caste, right? That's what it is about. If Smith and Marx and Ricardo make this argument that if wages are high in one place and low in another, then workers will move from the low wages towards the high. And this will increase the supply of labor and bring the wages down. And on the contrary, as workers move out of the low wages, their supply will decrease, so their wages will go up. So you get this process of adjustment, and they say it's not equality, it's some process of adjustment. Well, it turns out there's a tool in physics called Fokker-Planck equations, which are about particle interactions, and in which they have some kind of central tendency. And that tool turns out to be exactly appropriate for this. And we were able to show that we can derive the patterns that the physicists have observed from this fundamental principle in economics. For me, that's very important because I believe that the patterns we observe have to be addressed from a unitary framework. You can't make up the answer for each new pattern. That's why I don't believe in many of the proposals of the left, which is, it's a local issue, it's a local pattern. This is clearly not local. They've now shown it in 67 countries. That's a lot of countries, the same pattern. So that is a pattern that essentially says that there is a caste, but the people who occupy that caste are variable. And we can actually trace blacks and women going in and out of these different levels if we have the data. The data exists, by the way, but for me to get access to it, I have to be allowed to join the IRS. And I suspect with my portfolio, that's not going to be likely. Saez is a member of the IRS, too, by the way. He can do it. I can't. So I think capitalism, I've heard people say many times, there are no general laws of society. Well, that's quite true. Marx would never argue that. There are patterns which are old class, which is certainly a pattern that exists in much of human history. But the specific patterns are those that derive from the operations of class, of capitalism. And that is why Marx spent those 40 years observing and understanding and explaining from a unified framework how those patterns are. That's my philosophy. I'm therefore somewhat unhappy with the kind of eclectic nature of much of the Marxist discussion, which invents a new pattern a new explanation for every pattern that it had not previously saw. And therefore, I'm also opposed to this idea of monopoly, because it allows you to say, well, it's the will of the monopolists. It's very odd for me to hear Marxists talking about capitalism being run by will, because that implies that the whole emphasis that Marx makes on the laws, on competition that enforce themselves over the capitalists is gone. And now the capitalists are elevated to power. And that means that if we as leftists attack the capitalists, we're basically eating their flesh and getting power from that. But I believe that capitalists are also subordinate to this. So that's one part of the question. You said something about spending power. It's possible in the same framework to explain why workers get some wages that they do, which is part of the historical struggle. There's no question about that. Capitalism permits a higher wage, but workers have to seize that higher wage. So that is the whole class struggle issue, the determination of the rate of surplus value, rate of exploitation. Marx is absolutely clear and I think absolutely powerful in explaining that part. But that requires you to understand how the balance of forces change. Anybody can see that there was a big shift in the balance of power from 1940s to 1980s, where the working class, because of the prior struggles, the rise of the welfare state, had achieved a certain degree of security and power in terms of wages and their future and jobs and so on, and that the neoliberal revolution that took place with Thatcher and Reagan and all the others who shifted in the 80s, shifted that balance of power. It's very easy to see. You can actually plot the necessary variables and you can see that. Well, then you have to explain, why was neoliberalism so popular? This relates back to the question of Thatcher. It lowered wages. But by lowering wages, it raised the profit rate and it raised the growth of employment, and workers who previously were kept out of the labor market because they weren't in unions and all that were actually better off. The workers in unions were worse off, but employment, full employment was pretty close, 3% unemployment. And that meant that many workers who were disgruntled and even hostile to unions could get jobs. And so their hostility was justified in that sense. If we look at capitalism abstractly, and this is Hayek's point, class, labor, that ignores the fact that capitalism creates in every institution and in every set of the population conflict among the members. And this is the point Marx makes. Low wages go to high wages. Well, guess what? High wage workers don't want the influx of low wage workers. They want a Trumpian wall. And they're right. They're right. On the other hand, low wages coming in are also right that when they get inside, their wages are higher. And that conflict is inherent in the economic structure and patterns, not merely some decision, a political decision made by, or political or lack of understanding. They understand. If we don't understand, our difficulty is that we don't understand, not theirs. Now, I'm not saying that workers are right. Surely that's not true any more than anybody else is right. Or that they can have views, which I strongly believe are false, but that's understanding humans. Their place in society does not make them more knowledgeable about everything, but they may definitely have more knowledge and understanding of that place.
Thank you very much, Anwar. We're a little bit over time, but this is really enjoyable and we really appreciated it.